All right, so in Pennsylvania, there is an ongoing Democratic primary for a U.S. Senate seat involving a couple of candidates I've actually talked about on this channel before. One of them is John Fetterman, who previously endorsed Bernie Sanders. He's the much more progressive candidate in this race, especially when compared to his corporate Democrat opponent, who is currently down by 30 percentage points to John Fetterman. And in his frustration, in the wake of some of the recent polling showing that he has almost no chance at becoming the Democratic nominee, he is deciding to, instead of falling behind the clearly more popular candidate, double down on smearing John Fetterman in an attempt to basically eviscerate any chance that he might have against the Republican in the general election. So here from Politico, they say super PAC signals Pennsylvania primary could get rough. So here's some of the details. They say a super PAC backing Pennsylvania Senate candidate Connor Lamb is warning prospective donors that he is trailing frontrunner John Fetterman by 30 percentage points in the Democratic primary, and that the public's perception of his opponent's ideology must change for Lamb to have a shot. And he says, quote, primary voters don't yet see Fetterman as the liberal that he is, reads a memo circulated by the pro-Lamb group Penn Progress, which was obtained by Politico. And they say, for Connor Lamb to have a path in the primary, this dynamic needs to change. And they say, unlike the bloodbath taking place in the Republican primary in Pennsylvania, the contest on the Democratic side has been a relatively tame affair, and Fetterman and Lamb haven't laid a finger on each other on TV, and no outside Democratic groups have aired attacks on television either. So, in other words, when they just present themselves as they are and represent the policy platforms that they're putting forward to these constituents within Pennsylvania, these Pennsylvania constituents are overwhelmingly favoring John Fetterman. So they're now coming to the conclusion that, well, if we can't sell this boring corporate hollow Democrat to these people directly, we're just going to have to turn around and completely smear John Fetterman. So a little bit more details. They say the 9-page slide deck disseminated by Penn Progress after a recent fundraising call with donors suggests that could soon change, and the document highlights the testing of aggressive negative messaging against Fetterman, who is Pennsylvania's lieutenant governor, including that he is a dangerous radical who proudly calls himself a socialist, supports far-left policies like a $34 trillion government takeover of healthcare, in other words, Medicare for all. He supports universal healthcare that would be free at the point of service for the American people, and has spoken at Defund the Police rallies and wants to release convicted felons back onto our streets. So, of course, completely disingenuous framing here. Number one, he doesn't even support defund the police, which is a position I would disagree with, but it's a straight up lie to suggest that he does support defunding the police, and also releasing convicted felons back out onto the streets. He basically supports reforming the criminal justice system so that people who are innocent or people who have been given extremely unfair sentences for minor crimes are not sitting in jail for the rest of their lives. Okay, so again, completely disingenuous framing on that front, on police reform and criminal justice reform, but especially on something like Medicare for all, calling it a $34 trillion government takeover of healthcare, okay? This is coming from a super PAC that's supporting a Democrat, okay? Understand, this is the exact same talking points you could hear from a Republican from, 2 decades ago, all right? They're still using the same goddamn talking points, not pointing out the fact that, you could call it a $34 trillion government takeover of healthcare, but all of the major studies that we have access to show that Medicare for all would be cheaper than our current healthcare system, okay? This is what they never tell you, is that however big a number you want to attach to a government-run health insurance system like Medicare for all, it would be less than what the American people are currently paying right now, which is the single highest per capita and total amount that we pay in healthcare of any country in the entire world. So we already have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, and we're getting lesser results than other comparable OECD nations in terms of health outcomes for our people. So again, any other alternative healthcare system, especially one like Medicare for all that is truly universal, would be massively preferable. But of course they portray this from the austerity mindset of let's pass on this cost directly to the American people and bankrupt them for the crime of getting sick, instead of pointing out that we would have an actual truly universal system that would cover everybody free at the point of service under Medicare for all. And again, of course, calling him a dangerous radical who proudly calls himself a socialist. Okay, completely ridiculous, disingenuous framing, trying to smear him essentially. But They continue here saying, Connor hasn't been able to gain ground with Democrats, so he's decided to run like a Republican and use Fox News talking points to attack a fellow Democrat, said Fetterman spokesperson Joe Calvello. And he said, this is a desperate move from a campaign that hasn't been able to raise money on its own and hasn't broken through with anyone except for some political insiders. And Abby Nassif Murphy, Lamb's campaign manager, shot back saying, this material did not come from our campaign, but the fact that John Fetterman thinks only Fox News Republicans oppose socialism, defunding the police, and banning all private health insurance shows how out of touch he really is with reality and why the Republicans are dying to run against him in the fall. So again, completely disingenuous framing here. First of all, you're saying that you didn't put out these talking points directly to the super PAC and then follow it up by saying that you do actually agree with every single thing that the super PAC was just alleging against John Fetterman, these brazen lies and smears against him. But again, framing a Medicare for all system, framing supporting Medicare for all, okay, a truly universal healthcare system that would be, again, free at the point of service for all the American people, would eliminate the, possibility of medical debt, which is the single most common cause of debt in the United States, would, prevent people from going bankrupt from medical debt, would prevent them from going into debt because of, medical bills, etc. So, they frame that as banning all private health insurance, okay? So again, just completely disingenuous, ridiculously corrupt framing that only somebody who is being bragged by the private health insurance companies would be willing to come out and say. So completely disingenuous and disgusting framing there. But what else would you expect from a corporate Democrat like Connor Lamb? So they continue here, pointing out some of the specific data points in the polls that were within this that pretty much just disprove everything that they just said about John Fetterman and his radical socialist platform not being, something that would be popular amongst the Pennsylvania constituency. So they say the document cites a poll of the May 17th primary, which was conducted by Impact Research in early February, that found that 47% of likely primary voters are for Fetterman, compared to 17% for Lamb, so again up by 30, and 7% for Malcolm Kenyatta, 5% for Sharif Street, and 3% for Val Arkush, and 13% are undecided. So it's an absolutely massive lead. John Fetterman clearly out in the front of the rest of the pack. So if you were to follow along with this this phrase that we hear all the fucking time, especially in the 2020 Democratic primary, we heard this as a pushback to Bernie Sanders staying in the race, is vote blue no matter who, right? Vote blue no matter who is in the lead, and then we'll just get behind them, and everybody has to rally and shut your mouth and don't try to smear Joe Biden and all of these Bernie supporters. You just have to fall in line and show up and vote for Joe Biden, right? That's the tagline that we heard over and over and over again. And yet when it comes to now a Bernie Sanders style Senate candidate who's clearly in the lead and it's not even remotely close, they turn around and they say, no, we're actually going to use this as an opportunity not to rally behind this candidate, the most popular one, but instead to try to smear him and take him down and do as much damage as possible to either maybe scrap by and eke out a win for Connor Lamb at the last minute, and jeopardize any chance you had against the Republican candidate, or to just hurt John Fetterman, because when it comes down to it, what they just set up here is pretty much an admission of what their actual position is that they are closer to Fox News Republicans than they are to John Fetterman, meaning they're closer to Fox News Republicans than they are to policies like Medicare for all, or the Green New Deal, or legalizing marijuana, which are all flagship parts of John Fetterman's policy program. So again, they're kind of saying the quiet part out loud by saying that their corporate Democrat is much more closely aligned with Republican ideology than he is with the vast majority of Democratic constituents. So refuting their own point here by their actions. But they continue with more details, saying, according to the poll, Fetterman is also supported by 40% of Democratic voters who prefer a moderate candidate. 40%, and that's a plurality. And the margin of error was plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. So again, directly, their own polling data is directly refuting the point they're trying to make. The point they're trying to make is John Fetterman is a radical socialist who couldn't possibly win against a Republican when it comes to the general election, but their own polling data is showing that Fetterman has the most support amongst so-called moderates, okay? More support than the moderate candidate Connor Lamb. So again, just completely refuting their own points. And you see the overlap with, this versus what happened in the Democratic primary. I hate to keep bringing it up, but it's pretty much a one-to-one correlation with the same exact goddamn talking points we hear over and over and over again whenever it comes to somebody who wants to reform some of our glaringly broken systems, right? When they come out here and they say that Bernie Sanders couldn't have possibly won because he wouldn't have been able to win over moderate voters, well, what is your definition of moderate? Because all of the major flagship policy proposals that were put forward by Bernie Sanders or were put forward now by John Fetterman, they're all overwhelmingly popular in the country. So if you're against those things, then you're against the majority of Americans, and you by definition are a far-right extremist conservative, not a moderate. So again, just, the way that they frame these things, the way that they choose to define these things is always to their benefit and always a disingenuous way of framing it. But again, 40% of Democratic voters, a plurality, support John Fetterman, who support a moderate candidate. So they also say that the presentation also showcased a separate survey done in mid-February on a potential general election matchup, and it found Fetterman initially leading the celebrity Dr. Oz by 9 percentage points, while Lamb was ahead by only 3. So again, even when it comes to a head-to-head matchup against the Republican, Fetterman does better. So all of your arguments that you're trying to make here by going on this smear campaign against John Fetterman are immediately refuted by all of your own polling data that you're putting out here. Okay, so understand their actual goals, their actual primary function in doing this is to sacrifice John Fetterman at the altar of allowing conservatism to win the election, whether or not that conservatism takes form in Connor Lamb, or whether or not that conservatism takes form in a whack job like Dr. Oz. They could give a shit, okay? This super PAC does not give a shit about whether a Democrat or a Republican wins when those Democrats and Republicans are virtually in line ideologically, or at least on the major policies. What super PACs like this are actually against is allowing any form of even mild left-wing insurgency to occur within the Democratic Party. So that much is pretty clear what their intentions are. And of course, as pointed out here by Ryan Grimm, if in November John Fetterman does win the primary and then ends up losing the general election, of course they would use this as an opportunity to say that progressives can't win elections, even if it comes only because of a massive smear campaign from corporate Democrats. So again, you see right through their bullshit. But just to give you guys a little bit of a perspective on some of the major flagship items within his agenda, I'll link his website down below. What John believes: so at least $15 minimum wage, all work has dignity and paychecks must too. Healthcare is a fundamental human right, supports Medicare for all. Climate change is an existential threat. We need to transition to clean energy as quickly as possible, and we can create millions of good union jobs in the process. Weed should be legal nationwide. For jobs, justice, veterans, farmers, and revenue, it's time to end the failed war on drugs. Immigration is what makes America America. Black Lives Matter. The union way of life is sacred. A woman's right to abortion is non-negotiable. LGBTQIA plus communities deserve equal protections under the law, and get corporate money out of politics. So again, you see exactly why a corporate super PAC would be against a guy like that. Now, I don't think he's a perfect candidate by any stretch of the imagination, but he's definitely superior to the alternative in Connor Lamb or Dr. Oz. So, you got to rally behind a guy like John Fetterman, who actually could shake things up. He doesn't fit the typical, way that people view more progressive candidates like members of the Squad, etc. And I think he could be a good alternative to have within the Democratic Party in order to try to lead the charge on some of those major flagship policy items that we all support and agree with. So, obviously this is not something that's unexpected. This is, again, exactly the MO of the Democratic Party, at least the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. They would much rather have a progressive lose to a Republican than, potentially have a progressive beat a Republican. So that's what their priorities are, very obvious here. This super PAC could give a shit if it's a Democrat or a Republican. The Democrats and Republicans, in this case, especially with Connor Lamb, are essentially saying the quiet part out loud and admitting that they are much more closely aligned with Fox News Republicans than they are with the vast majority of the country.